This section will address the following questions. Number one, how the South China Sea impact the strategic environment of the region after 2025. Number two, how does ASEAN envision itself in the regional security architecture, especially in addressing both traditional and non-traditional security issues in the South China Sea. Number three, what roles best fit ASEAN: an observer, a facilitator, or an actor that plays a central and active role in managing the situation and promoting cooperation. And finally, how could ASEAN enhance its role? So I have 6 speakers on my list. And I think that all the speakers are ready, but let me also very brief on the rules of the section. The speakers are kindly asked to limit their presentation within 7 minutes. And all the observations, comments, questions are also kindly requested to limit within 2 and 3 minutes. So in keeping with the schedule, I think the first speaker is ready, Mr. Nguyen bin Umar, Director of the Sultan Haji Hassanan Bolkiah Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies from Brunei Darussalam. Mr. Nizam, are you ready to speak? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. I thank our esteemed moderator for the kind introduction and to the organizers for the invitation to this important event. I look forward to the discussions today as issues relating to the South China Sea continue to be high in the region's agenda and remain to be some of the most complex in the region. ASEAN has made significant advances in managing them, but there is still a vast potential for more cooperation and further progress. The major power rivalry is clearly reflected in the South China Sea. Throughout the years, US-China relations remain to be the most significant bilateral relationship influencing the region's dynamics. In addition to China and the US, other major external powers, in particular ASEAN's dialogue partners, also claim to have some strategic interests and have strengthened their engagement in the region. While this has widened prospects of cooperation with ASEAN and its members, this has also translated into more extra-regional presence in the South China Sea. In the meantime, long-standing sovereignty disputes overlapping EEZs still persist, leading to displays of sovereignty, contributing to distrust and adding to the risk of miscalculation and misunderstanding. Against this backdrop, growing non-traditional security challenges threaten progress, as well as the well-being and livelihood of its people. These include piracy, armed robbery, maritime terrorism, trafficking in persons, illicit drugs, IUU fishing, and marine pollution. In addressing the wide and complex range of challenges, ASEAN must continue to be the center of regional affairs and must continue to play a central role in managing them. In recognizing its importance and complexity, ASEAN has placed maritime issues as a priority. Its management involves various sectors under all 3 community pillars. ASEAN engages dialogue partners for capacity building, including through information exchange and sharing of best practices, as well as through joint exercises. If we look in the realm of political and security cooperation, we can see there have been significant advancements. I'll highlight some of them. There's been, under the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, there's been some work on search and rescue and marine environmental protection. But perhaps the most prominent work that has been done is on the DOC and the continued efforts towards realizing a code of conduct in the South China Sea. The official start to negotiations on the COC was announced in 2017. While the single draft negotiating text was endorsed by ASEAN and China in 2018, wide differences have limited progress. Negotiations have also been postponed following the global pandemic. In the context of the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, ADMM and ADMM Plus, there have been some significant developments. Since their establishment, both the ADMM and ADMM Plus have promoted and built strong habits of cooperation. Work under the ADMM Plus Experts Working Group on Maritime Security has culminated in large-scale exercises that promote cooperation and interoperability in addressing common, non-traditional security threats. Initiatives related to maritime security include the ASEAN Direct Communications Infrastructure, which is essentially a hotline between two defense ministers to arrive at mutual decisions in handling crisis or emergency situations. The ADMM has also adopted guidelines for air encounters between military aircraft and guidelines for maritime interaction to reduce vulnerability to miscalculation and misunderstanding, as well as to contribute to the implementation of international law and regional conventions. India ARF, through work by the Intersessional Meeting on Maritime Security, the ARF has agreed to cooperate on various areas including piracy, transport security, search and rescue, offshore oil spill incidents, marine environmental protection, and IUU fishing. Other ASEAN mechanisms such as ASEAN Navy Chiefs Meeting, the AMF and expanded AMF, the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime have different roles in contributing to security and stability in the South China Sea. I think ASEAN has fulfilled these roles considerably well, producing practical and tangible outcomes with strong support from dialogue partners. So what next? As for the roles of ASEAN post-2025, I would expect those roles to continue. It's difficult to imagine that the challenges faced relating to the South China Sea can be overcome in the near future. So we would expect ASEAN to continue taking the comprehensive approach that has so far been serving its purpose. However, comprehensive solutions seem elusive. This has been true with the COC. There have been many calls by observers to ASEAN to go beyond so-called low-hanging fruits, which brings me to my first point. It's time to leverage on confidence it has built over the past decades. ASEAN's unity and interstate relations have been tested and trying to manage differences in South China Sea issues. Negotiating the COC is an example of ASEAN looking at difficult issues head-on. The single negotiating text was a significant breakthrough, but there are wide differences on some issues. In the ASEAN context, there seems to be a strong desire for concluding negotiations for a meaningful code of conduct, and expectations are high for ASEAN to do so. My second point is on confidence and rationalizing cooperation. Within the ADMM umbrella, there is no doubt that practical cooperation such as field training exercises have high confidence building value. ASEAN must continue building confidence. However, these measures must ensure to be impactful, providing value to high-level objectives. As more attention and resources are being put in safeguarding national interests, measures that look at strengthening operational safety become increasingly important. In this regard, the ADMM has adopted cues in its framework and incorporated them in ADMM exercises. In addition to cues, we can expect the application of ADMM initiatives that strengthen operational safety to be incorporated in those exercises and put into practice. Underpinning all that is ASEAN centrality and the organization's ability to bring together its members, engage dialogue partners, and push for a workable regional agenda. And that is my final point. ASEAN countries acknowledge that individually they could not effect change in their surrounding environment, nor could they significantly influence strategic rivalry and competition in the region. However, as a collective, intergovernmental organization, ASEAN must remain steadfast and take a proactive approach in providing that stability and facilitating the extra-regional engagement in its environment. This is crucial to ASEAN's efforts to continuously build the ASEAN community. I thank you, Moderator.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nizam bin Umar, for your very interesting, substantive, especially the comprehensive approach of ASEAN towards 2025. So the next speaker is Dr. Dino Jalal. Dr. Dino, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Your floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. And I want to commend Vietnam for the very low number of COVID cases that you have. I'm really amazed at it. If you need some more number, just tell us and we'll send you some. Right? Okay, so to answer your question, and the question of this session, which is post-2025, what happens? What does ASEAN want to achieve in the South China Sea? I think the answer is very simple. The answer is ASEAN must be a driver of events in the South China Sea. And in terms of vision, I think what is important is that ASEAN must do all it can to make South China Sea a zone or an area of cooperation rather than dangerous rivalries. Right? Let me make a couple of points on what we should like to see by 2025 and after. Right? One is definitely we hope that the code of conduct will be done by then. And that code of conduct will not be just normative or a piece of paper, like Fabiola said earlier, but would be substantive. I think we are in a better place now than before with regard to the code of conduct because it signals a shift in China's position. China before only wanted to deal with countries on a bilateral basis, but then it moved that it can deal with the ASEAN claimants. And it moved further in showing that it can deal also with ASEAN as a whole, right? So I think this is a significant shift in their policy as reflected in the negotiation of the Code of Conduct. And this Code of Conduct negotiation is also good help are sitting on the table, and they're comfortable with the format because they're not sitting against big China bilaterally, but they're sitting together on the basis of equality. Right? So we hope that by that time the Code of Conduct will be signed and will become a effective and credible guideline on how countries can navigate, in terms of rules of the game in the disputed areas. But I do hope that ASEAN will not be shy into entering into hard negotiation, the tough love, right? Because I think what is important is we have a credible document that is also implemented very well. Because, in ASEAN we have some documents that, are good conceptually, but have not really been implemented. For example, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation provided for the eminent person who resolve conflicts. This is way this provide, but until it has never been used, and that's another, executed very well, if at all, right? Secondly, I would love to see by 2025 really a practical cooperation among the ASEAN. Sir?
Any problem? With the technical problem?
I hope you can see me now, yeah. I would really love to see claimants. Now, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Can
you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes, okay. Okay, so the second, yes, thank you. So the second thing I would love to see after 25, just one practical cooperation among the ASEAN claimants, or better yet, even with China, yeah? I say this because we've been talking about cooperation for decades now, right? Since 1990s, in fact, right? So that's more than 30 years. But until now,
so
has not.
but I didn't know you are far away from us. That's why there will be some technical problem happen again.
These what has been. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, please continue.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Yes, okay. Getting just one practical cooperation among the ASEAN claimants, or better yet, ASEAN and China, would be a huge political and psychological boost to establishing South-China Sea as an area of cooperation. But we got to be honest about this. In the last 30 years, there has not been one, even though everybody talks about it, right? And I know some people are talking about joint development. That's not going to happen soon, because if you can't get joint cooperation on the smallest things, even just fisheries or seaside level or whatever, you're not going to have joint development on hydrocarbons. That's just too far away from us. The other thing is, I would love to see after 2025, China clarifying the coordinates of the 9 dash lines, right? Right now we just see the lines, right? But when we ask them, hey, where are the coordinates? Show us something at least, right? China has not done that, right? And that makes dialogue with China quite difficult. What is this based on? You base it on historical claims, but exactly point out where it is at, right? And again, China has not done that, and I hope this is something they can do in the next 4 years. Another would be useful after 2025 and this direction, it is to establish guidelines for military exercises in the EEZ of other countries in the South China Sea, right? UNCLOS doesn't really, have much guidance on this. It sort of left it out in the open, right? But for countries like Indonesia, we have a large EEZ. What if the United States or China or anybody starts exercising in our EEZ? What would be the rules to make sure that there is no mishaps or anything? The United States or China is not interested in this, but I think it would be useful if we at some point establish this guideline for military exercise in the EEZ of other countries, right? I don't think boundary negotiations will happen by 2025, simply because it's just too sensitive. And simply because China is not ready by then, it doesn't have even its coordinates ready. And some ASEAN claimants also are yet to consolidate their legal position on this. And besides, if you negotiate on boundaries, the question is between whom, right? If Malaysia and Vietnam does it, then the third or fourth claimant will say, hey, don't, that involves us too, right? So the question will be between whom, between which countries, and in which areas, right? And I don't think any country is ready to enter into that question at the moment. And then I hope two more small things. Freedom of navigation has to be maintained. Be it China, ASEAN, or United States, Japan, everybody says this is a key thing to ensure ability when countries say, right? We must really ensure that that is the interest of every country, literal and otherwise, in the South China Sea. And finally, my wish list for Christmas, and it's not going to happen, I'm not going to get it, it's not going to get it, is for US to ratify UNCLOS. We know about this issue, but President Joe Biden, I really doubt he has time to push this issue through the Senate because he's got too many things to worry about: jobs, economic recovery, and all the other things. And he knows if he has to push this through a Republican Senate, it's going to be shut down. So that's unfortunate, but that's my wish list for post-25 South China Sea. Simply ASEAN becoming a driver of events in the region, and secondly, for South China Sea becoming an area of cooperation rather than rivalry. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Dino Jalar. We thank you for your comments on a very sensitive and very substantive issues of ASEAN, such as the driver role of ASEAN and the free navigation and COC and etc. Thank you for that. And the next speaker on my list is Dr. Chang Wanari. He's the president of ASEAN Vision Institute from Cambodia. Dr. Vanarit, are you ready to speak? So, floor is
Thank
yours.
you, Ambassador, and would like to thank the organizer for the opportunity. I would like to join my co-panelists of this session. So after listening to the first session, I think we feel a bit pessimistic about the world and the region at large because it seems that great power politics dominate international affairs and we fall into the trap of it's what we call a great power capture, which means that the great power dominate the international agenda. Small and middle-sized powers do not have any agency or say in this international system. But after listening to my two colleagues, my two colleagues here, we can see some kind of positive side of the international system and the role of ASEAN. Of course, we need to accept the limited role of ASEAN in engaging this very complex regional security issue in the South China Sea, but we need to keep faith in the role of ASEAN as well. I myself is a believer in international institutions. I'm a believer and have deep trust in ASEAN. It's not the first time that ASEAN needs to face this kind of challenging times. ASEAN have gone through more than 5 decades of, surviving great power politics, surviving regional geopolitical rivalry. So I think the future of ASEAN in the post-2025 will remain resilient and will continue to strive to navigate through these uncertain times. The question here is it possible to build peace within this context of chaotic world or anarchic world? I do believe that it is possible because, perceptions, strategic narrative, national interests can be converged, can be shared. I believe that opportunities that we can deliver in this region can be shared, especially the economic opportunities. So let us imagine the post-2025 ASEAN. I think we could foresee a stronger ASEAN, a more integrated, more interconnected ASEAN, a more, kind of strategic weight and strategic economic weight as well of ASEAN in this region. And the signing of a regional comprehensive economic partnership yesterday was a critical milestone in making ASEAN to take the center stage of this regional economic fulcrum in the Asia Pacific. So to envision ASEAN in the post-2025, the role of ASEAN in the South China Sea, perhaps we could have a certain ambition here in order for ASEAN to build a kind of a regional-based order as a driver of regional, the rule-based regional order. So we have three pathways in order to realize that role. First, we need to build a trust-based relationship and cooperation. Of course, it's easier said than done, but we have done before and we are doing now is to promote the dialogue, frank, open dialogue, so that we can develop, nurture trust, especially strategic trust. And this transparency, this mutual understanding will help us to contain the conflicts from escalating into armed confrontations. And I personally don't think that the war will happen or erupt in the South China Sea between the US and China or between the claimant states, because it's too costly to have any armed confrontation or war in these regions. And I don't think both China and the United States are willing to wage a war in these regions. So that is the bottom line. So if war is very low, have a low likelihood, so we can contain this kind of conflict to a certain degree. through dialogue and cooperation. But trust can be sustained by a repeated compliance with rules and norms. So that I go to the why rules and norms really matter in the South China Sea. So what are the legal sources of norms and rules construction in the South China Sea? Some previous speaker mentioned about the TAC, the Treaty of Armaging Cooperation. This is a very critical legal document that we can enforce in order to promote this kind of rule-based regional order in the South China Sea. And another document we're talking about is the negotiating code of conduct, which will be completed or finalized sometime in the future, if not in 2021. It may take extra 1 or 2 years to complete the negotiation of the COC. And this is another key legal document that can shape the behavior of the claimants in the South China Sea. And you know, the role of ASEAN here is to send a signal, send a clear signal that it would be a high cost, diplomatic cost, if any claimant violates the future COC. So that enforcement mechanism is very critical for the COC to be functional and effective to contribute to the rule-based regional order in the South China Sea. The third point here is kind of joint cooperation, functional cooperation in the South China Sea. There are various attempts to have this kind of cooperation on fishery sector, on marine debris, environmental protection, and so on. So that is a low-hanging fruit that we can all work together to achieve those cooperation areas. Of course, when it comes to the joint exploration of oil and gas, perhaps it's more sensitive. It's difficult to reach that, let alone the negotiation on the sovereignty and maritime boundaries. So we just attempt to achieve what we can do, kind of realistically speaking, fishery cooperation on fishery sector, maritime environment, piracy, and so on. Those are the key areas that we could achieve through regional functional cooperation. So looking forward, ASEAN 2025, what we need to do more is to strengthen multilateralism, strengthen ASEAN-centric regional architecture, to work together as a collective agency to prevent the interest of all the member states and to prevent and protect themselves from the great power capture, meaning that great powers dominate and dictate the global and regional agenda. So that's why we have issued our own vision of Indo-Pacific strategy in order to have our say, have our agency in shaping the regional order, including the regional order in the South China Sea. So I would like to conclude my remarks with the optimistic view that ASEAN will continue to strive and be able to navigate through these uncertain times. So thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Wadarit. We are very interested in your comments because it's touch upon the very substantive issues and the core issues of the region, particularly when we touch upon the questions of the trust-based and rule-based regional order in the region, which is very crucial to prevent the conflict management and resolution of the issues in the region. We thank you for that. And our next speaker is Mr. Sharikman Lokman. Lokman is fellow of Foreign Policy and Security Studies Division, Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. Mr. Lokman, are you ready to take floor?
Yep, I'm ready.
So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Great to see everyone, all my friends. First of all, thank you to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for the kind invitation. I have to start by saying that these are my personal views and do not represent those of my institute or my government. I have three very quick points to make. Essentially, I'm going to leave a lot for the discussion. First point is that we are asked to take the long view in this session, post-2025. As that very famous great philosopher Yogi Berra once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. But I'll try, I guess. First point is that ASEAN is and will continue to be, even after 2025, a very imperfect instrument for managing the situation in the South China Sea. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think that ASEAN is going to help resolve the situation in South China Sea, you will be sorely disappointed. If your expectation is for it to build confidence, CBM stuff, if it's conflict management, fine. I think that's a reasonable expectation to make. But beyond that, I think that ASEAN will have very limited sort of like a utility. For that reason, ASEAN member states, ASEAN claimants, and China, I guess, but mostly ASEAN claimants, will continue to rely on a variety of methods, bilateral, unilateral, in fact, even, and they're going to also rely on the influence of extra-regional countries in addition to the traditional partners. Simply because you can see from the reactions of ASEAN member states to the interventions of the United Kingdom, of France, of Germany in submitting their notes verbal to the CLCS, especially. It's been rather muted, almost curious to see what they are all about. They are not opposed to it simply because I think, in spite of some of them claiming that they do not wish for extra-regional countries to intervene, deep inside their hearts, I think they do see some utility for the intervention of some, not intervention, I must not use that word, but rather the subtle influence of extra-regional countries. The reason that ASEAN will continue to be of limited utility is simply because cohesiveness is going to be a problem for quite some time, and it's going to be a problem even more so, I think. For one thing, some ASEAN member states are being drawn more and more into China's strategic orbit. It is quite interesting that we are just 1 year, next year it will be Brunei, but the year after will be Cambodia, and one wonders whether 2022 will be similar to 2012. And we must remember that in 2012, I think the influence of the European Union was still quite strong, even though weakening. I think China's influence in Cambodia and some countries, Laos perhaps, is even more stronger than it is in the past. And as a result, I suspect that cohesiveness is going to be a real issue. The other problem, of course, is the dispute among ASEAN member states. We cannot deny that, whether we like it or not, there are disputes between ASEAN member states, and in some cases, they are intensifying. Philippines, for example, under this administration has made it, maybe under this Secretary of Foreign Affairs, has made Sabah an even bigger issue than it was in recent past. Indonesia has issued its new map, it's 2017. They still claim to be not a claimer in the South China Sea, but their footprint in the South China Sea has certainly grown. So yeah, there is that intra-regional issue. My second point is this. Whatever it is, the regional strategic environment post-2025 is going to be heavily influenced by the interactions between China and the United States. And one half of that equation is, of course, the US. I agree with the points of previous speakers that it is much too early to say, to sort of figure out whether Biden administration is premature to actually figure out what the Biden presidency will bring. What I can say is, of course, Biden is known to be an old hand on foreign relations. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he has views of his own. On the other hand, my superficial understanding of the U.S. is that he is going to be heavily involved, heavily busy. He's going to have his hands tied on domestic issues, and the problem is not going to come from what appears to be what will become a Republican-controlled Senate, but also within his party. There is a big schism within his party between the moderates on the one hand and the progressive left on the other. It is really a collection of warring tribes. So he's going to be tied down with that sort of issue. So I guess what we have to look at is who he appoints as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. You know, it has become cliche to say personnel is policy, but it is true in this sense. So yeah, it will depend a lot on his appointments. My third point is this, that some resource issues are going to be a source of complication more than others. You know, what do I mean by that? I think that fisheries will become an even more serious issue than it is today. The collapse of fisheries in the South China Sea has long been predicted. I think people who are more well-versed on this issue tell me that we are quite close to reaching that point. I think the fact that the northern part of the South China Sea has been fished to death means that more and more ships will be coming down south, including to Malaysia and EEZ. And this is going to cause a lot more problems between Malaysia and Vietnam. I think this is something that both countries will need to pay attention to. And very quickly, let me just say this, that hydrocarbons will become less of an issue, simply because in spite of what people have been saying in the past, I think they are right this time. I think that the end of oil is coming very, very soon. I've been a skeptic on this issue for some time, but all indications is that oil will not recover to levels that we saw in the past, and that exploration of oil and gas the business case for exploration of oil and gas will not return. It will not return, oil prices will probably not return to above $60, which is the price above which oil exploration becomes economical. And I think as a result, oil will be less of an issue in terms of competition. I think those countries that are beginning exploration in the South China Sea, I'm afraid it's a bit too late. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Lokman. Thank you for the comprehensive comments and observations on the region, and also touch upon the power outside our region, especially the future approach of the new administration in the U.S. It is the concern of all the countries in the region and outside the region. So the next speaker is Dr. Kavi. He's a senior fellow, the Institute of Strategic and International Studies from Thailand. Mr. Kavi, are you ready to take floor?
Yes, I'm ready. Xin chào Ambassador Nguyen Đập Hong. It's nice to meet you again online. After the first session, I felt a little bit uneasy, but after listening to my colleague from ASEAN, I feel much better now because ASEAN is still relevant. And I'd like to echo the point that brought about by ASEAN colleague Dino, Chen and Lokman, that ASEAN has to stick together. And one of the most important instruments that ASEAN must rely on, which Dino has referred to, is Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And I think in the future, in the post-2025 TAC, Treaty of Amity will be even more expansive, gain recognition from around the world. At the moment, as of last week, there are a total of 43 signatories to the Treaty of Amity. 40 years ago, nobody thought that Treaty of Amity would have such a wide recognition. Now ASEAN is working very hard to gain more and more recognition from the international community, especially those countries who want to see this region, as Dino alluded to, as a zone of sustained peace, security, and prosperity. Now, Treaty of Amity has become, I think, an instrument that can be expanded. Why? Because most of the major countries in the United Nations, including UN Security Council, have already acceded and agreed to all the cardinals principles enshrined in the Treaty of Amity. I even imagine that one day this Treaty of Amity cooperation in Southeast Asia will be able to transform into the Treaty of Amity and cooperation in Indo-Pacific. You know, Indo-Pacific these days has been in the news, and that we are addressing issue toward Indo-Pacific, and as you all know, ASEAN is situated right in the middle of South Asia and also Pacific. So I think this will be the key instrument. Of course, as Chair Nguyen alluded to, COC. Now there is some doubt that COC will be complete by next year, but I'm quite confident that given the time and the political view that have been prevailing between China and ASEAN, I think there will be sufficient time to work on substantive and effective COC. It must be substantive and effective COC. That will be the outcome of the negotiation. I would like to suggest that since the negotiation between ASEAN on China is only at the moment focused heavily on the COC and then try to implement in totality the DOC since 2012. But they should add more environment, which both Dino and Chern Vanarit have also referred to. That is the third element. Whatever cooperation that can be done in the maritime disputed area. I'm not talking about the high-end, oil and gas exploration. I'm talking about those basic things that will increase trust level. I agree with Chern Vanarit that the trust level between China and ASEAN is no longer the same. It has to be built up. That explains why ASEAN has not yet agreed to the request by China to upgrade the strategic relations into upper level of comprehensive strategic partnership. That thing will come only after ASEAN decided that the trust level has reached the more comfortable level. So before I end, I have a few suggestions. I think ASEAN can work on the so-called maritime cooperation in, number one, try to make sure that corporations in the environment protection. Secondly, in maritime management, of course, these are very easy said and done, especially on the maritime debris. I think Japan has already very extensive program and also committed financial to ASEAN to manage this problem. And then you also have things that we can do right away, enhance research on the marine resource and other things, and also sharing information. And lastly, I think this is the point that we often ignore, because we often read headlines in the global media, cable TV about the dispute without other aspects of the situation and development. So I think we must have a very coherent communication strategy that increase the awareness of the public about the nature of what's going on in South China Sea, the dispute, whatever has been made, the progress that has been made, and all the involved country. I think if we have done that, ASEAN will continue to play the role of the facilitator, hedging, jumping from one role to the other to make sure that the tension will be managed, that there will cause no further conflicts that will bring in arms confrontation. And I think if we have done that, ASEAN will remain in what Dr. Surin Pisawan, the former Secretary General, has said, in the driver's seat. And of course, we must also have valid driver license. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. KD, for very relevant observations that related to ASEAN. That is, such as the ASEAN should stick together, the TAC expansion, especially practically that recently, Cuba also recently joined the TAC. Cuba is far away from us, but I think that the country see the meaning and the effectiveness of this of TAC, and also the other question you also mentioned that the effective and substantive COC, and you also suggested three concrete suggestions at the end of the observations. Thank you for that. And the last speaker on my list is Mr. Richard Hidarian. Hidarian is a fellow of ADR, State-Based Institutes of the Philippines. Mr. Hidarian, are you ready to take floor?
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador.
Please go ahead,
for hearing, and thank you for the Diplomatic Academy for the kind invitation. I actually sent a PowerPoint, maybe it could be projected because I'm having some problem uploading it. Usually speaking after lunch is not my favorite, and of course speaking the last in such a great panel is also not my favorite. It seems many topics and issues were already covered. But nonetheless, I really like this long view discussion because I think the long view discussion allows us to go beyond the more depressive or pessimistic aspects of our contemporary geopolitics in South China Sea in order to look at what could we do in the coming years and decades. Now, I know in the World Economic Forum and in Wall Street journals of this world, there's a lot of discussion about the fourth industrial revolution, that we're in the new phase of innovation when it comes to our industries and how that's going to change our lives and our world. I think the ASEAN is also facing in many ways what I could call a fourth reset or fourth soul searching. The first one was during the era of Confrontazi in the 1960s when the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and later on the emerging Singapore were at each other's loggerheads. So the Mapilindo in many ways and the Confrontazi were precursors for the creation of ASEAN. And then later on in the 70s and 80s, we faced the Indochina crisis and the question of admitting communist regimes and regimes with, on the other side of the Cold War fence into the ASEAN. And eventually we did that also very successfully. So we ended the Confrontazi. We were able to integrate Vietnam, Cambodia, and other countries into ASEAN. And then, of course, the third reset or soul searching we faced was in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Iron Curtain. And there, I think all of our discussions about ASEAN being in the driver's seat, and as Akavi said, having the driver's license to do that, came into being. But now I think we're facing a new era, and I think a fourth reset and a fourth rethink, that we can call that a post-Trump era or a post-American era. And I think this era in itself demands a significant degree of rethink on the part of ASEAN and what we want to happen in the future. For some reason, my PowerPoint is not being presented. The same thing happened to me 4 years ago there, but it's okay. We had a very detailed report with Brookings Institute earlier this year, ASEAN at the Crossroads, where I really break down these issues in detail, and perhaps later on that could be shared. But for our discussions today, because we have a very limited time, let me go to the relevance of why we need a big rethink in the ASEAN. I think what we're facing in ASEAN today is what we can call a middle institutional trap. It's very similar to the concept of middle income trap. Middle income trap is when policies that help you to go from low income to middle income will no longer help you in the next stage of development. I think in many ways, if you look at ASEAN, we're also facing a middle institutional trap, meaning the decision-making modalities that allowed us to bring 10 very diverse countries together quite successfully are no longer really helping us in dealing with the next stage of geopolitics, which is the rise of China and how to mediate regional security architecture amid rising tensions between the superpowers. I think that's a lot because of the fact that our understanding of muwafaqat, which in Arabic means something closer to consensus, is more or less unanimity. That if you don't have all countries on board on a sensitive issue like South China Sea, it's almost impossible for us to even get a robust statement on the South China Sea. So it's quite disconcerting that even though China has been changing the facts on the ground quite aggressively over the past decade, especially since 2030 December, hardly China is mentioned as kind of a threat to regional security. And the best we can do, and kudos to Vietnam for pushing the envelope this year, is to indirectly mention the threats that are posed by China. And that's the limitation that we face with this kind of a unanimity-based, decision-making modality. Let's also look at the fact that in the next 5 to 10 years, ASEAN is also going to face major, almost existential challenges. If you look at climate change, for instance, my country, the Philippines, is among top 2 or top 3 most vulnerable countries in the world. Whether you look at the HSBC or German Watch kind of reports, and if you look at also the International Labour Organization report, more than 50% of jobs in manufacturing sector, which are very important to creation of employment and political stability and legitimization in Southeast Asia, from Cambodia and Vietnam to Philippines and Indonesia, could also be affected. So we're facing existential challenges to our political economic stability, if not prosperity, in the coming years and decades. And I think that demands some significant rethink on the role of ASEAN and how we should come together, how we should create an economic community, and the kind of cooperative mechanisms to help us to get through this. The other thing is that we have to keep in mind also that China is increasingly adopting a kind of a divide and conquer strategy, which makes it very impossible for us to come with consensus on important issues like South China Sea. All China has to do is to lean on one country or two, and then we're going to have a very serious problem. And that's where we see, in fact, in recent years, the tendency for us to come up with chairman statements because of the lack of consensus. And I think that's not a very good sign for the ASEAN and the way we're moving forward. And lastly, of course, we have to talk about robust institutional responses that we need to new non-traditional security challenges, whether it is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or maritime piracy and terrorism and transnational crime. All of this most likely will get worse, not get better, in the coming years as we enter more economic uncertainty, economic instability, and accordingly political instability and polarization in years to come. So I think what's happening in the United States should be a wake-up call for more fragile democracies, or for that matter, fragile autocracies in Southeast Asia, who are also going to face their own economic shocks. Now, speaking of recommendations, I think this is where we have to be a little bit creative, a little bit think outside the box. I mean, it's lovely to talk about code of conduct and whether it's valuable or not. From my point of view, a code of conduct which is legally binding is not necessarily good, especially if legally binding means China's version of international law, not the UNCLOS, not the Philippine-initiated arbitration award of 2016. I'll be also worried with the COC, which is legally binding, but excludes external players from energy exploration activities or their ability to conduct military exercises with individual countries. And it worries me that China has been injecting those points into the negotiations of COC over the past few years, and I'm glad that some of our neighbors have been pushing back. Nonetheless, I think we have to look at ways, first of all, to optimize consensus building. We have employed the ASEAN minus X formula in other realms of negotiation, whether this is, for instance, negotiations of AFTA CPT, ASEAN Free Trade Negotiations, and it kind of was successful. And I think it's time for us to discuss whether ASEAN minus X formula could also be applied to more sensitive geopolitical discussions like South China Sea. Why should we have all countries on board when all countries do not have the same threat perceptions or direct stake in the South China Sea? I mean, to be fair to Cambodians, they have no direct stake in the South China Sea, and they're too dependent on China to piece them up on this issue. So I think we have to think about other ways to come up with more effective decision-making modalities. I think our European friends, for instance, have the qualified majority voting modality, which even takes into consideration the differentials in demographics among others. So why should a country with 500,000 people have as much vote as a country with 280 million people? As Aristotle said, treating unequal people equally is in a form of injustice in itself. The second thing I think is very important and practical is embracing mini-lateralism. If ASEAN multilateralism is not going to step up to the plate, which it has not, and let's be very brutally honest about it, on sensitive issues like South China Sea, where parameters of geopolitical rivalry are most pronounced and dangerous, I think it's important for us to talk about mini-lateralism, meaning more coordination on an ad hoc basis among key countries within ASEAN on specific issues, including South China Sea. I think Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia can come together and discuss boundary issues. They can resolve their issues more in accordance with international law and the UNCLOS in ways that China will perhaps never agree under negotiation of code of conduct. And I believe under minilateralism, we should also talk about Quad plus minilateralism. I think there has to be more coordination among key countries within ASEAN and Quad countries, or our European partners, whether it's France, Germany, and United Kingdom, who are also having more say and more commitments in this part of the world. And lastly, I think this might sound crazy, but back in 2018, when we were in Australia having a strategic dialogue during the ASEAN-Australia Summit, some of our friends were discussing about the notion of associated membership, even for countries like Australia and New Zealand. And of course, we kind of laughed it off. But things could get so crazy and so unpredictable in years to come that we may need to have some serious discussion whether Australia and New Zealand, who are kind of our near to far neighbor, perhaps could have greater integration into the ASEAN framework and therefore make ASEAN a much more robust and effective driver of regional security. I mean, if you just look at the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, in my opinion, it just shows the weakness of ASEAN. It's an assertion of our centrality without any proof that we can be central. And that's why, accordingly, we have to have a big reset, our fourth big reset since the ugly days of confrontancy. We have come a long way, but the modalities that worked in the past may not work anymore as we face a new geopolitical reality. Thank you.
So, we thank you, Mr. Haidarian, for very comprehensive, very interesting comments and observations, and especially when you touch upon the question of the growing minilateral coordination among the key regional states. And it's very interesting, and we think that we may have other observation and comment on that. So now we move upon the part of Q&A part of the section, and of course we invite the comments and questions both from of our attendees, both online and in the room. The first question we got from Mr. Hoàng Thị Hà from the Institute of South Asia Studies in Singapore. And Mr. Hoàng Thị Hà, are you ready to raise the questions, and to whom?
Yes, can you hear me?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. I have two questions. The first one is to Mr. Mutsharu Nizam bin Umar from Brunei. As you know, this year, Vietnam, as the ASEAN chair, has taken a very robust legal approach to the South China Sea, especially in reinstating UNCLOS as the basis for determining maritime entitlement, sovereign rights, jurisdiction, and other interests, maritime interests in the maritime zones, and also as a legal framework for all activities in the oceans and the seas. This phrase has been reiterated in all chairman statements of ASEAN political security meetings this year. As the ASEAN chair next year, do you think Brunei will build upon this momentum of this principled approach and most specifically in maintaining this reference to UNCLOS? And the second question, since I have the floor, As all of you also already referred to in your presentation, China inserted in the current draft COC text a few provisions that aim to prevent regional countries from conducting military exercises with other powers in the South China Sea, and also to prevent foreign companies from outside the region from undertaking oil and gas development activities. From your national perspective and national interest, what is your assessment of this proposition, and if you have any chance to fly in the COC talks? I understand that there is a subsequent session on the COC later, but I still would love to hear the views from the speakers in this panel, given your caliber and influence as thought leaders in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ha. Uma, can you take response?
Thank you very much for that question. I'll talk about the provisions in the chairman's statement. Those provisions, most of them are not new, and we've been, Brunei has been, and most other ASEAN countries have been agreeing to the provisions during most of their chairmanship. And I don't see any reason why that cannot continue for next year. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brunei have also released a statement on the importance of UNCLOS in managing possible disputes. So really, currently I don't see anything that can prevent continuing the pushing for the same provisions for next year. Of course, I'm not representing the views of my government. That's my personal view. Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Uma. Any questions, comments from the room? Yes, please, Ms. Ha. Ms. Ha, identify yourself and then raise question to whom from our panelists.
Thank you, the moderator. I am representing the Society of International Law of Vietnam here. I have perhaps one comment and one question.
Yes,
my
please.
comment goes to the remark made by Dino Jala. He was saying that in 2025, we would expect China to give us the coordinates of the 9-dash line. And my comment is that in the first place, I would have a very great doubt on such a request, because according to the legal point of view, the 9-dash line doesn't have any lawful meaning, and we would not want to go ahead asking China to even officialize it by giving the coordinates. My question goes to the last speaker from the Philippines. He was mentioning the unilateralism. My question is that whether he has in mind any official smaller grouping that he thinks that should be introduced in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Mr. Richard, can you
Shall I go first?
reply?
Yeah, I think back in 2014 or 2030, there was kind of a quad discussion, but within the ASEAN, whereby Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei should have come together. This was a proposal by former Philippine Foreign Secretary Albert Rosario. For some reason, of course, it didn't push through. We can understand the hesitations of countries back then. And the Philippines was in the middle of an arbitration case against China, which was very contentious and not very much loved and supported by much of ASEAN, perhaps with the exception of Vietnam. But 6 years forward, we see more and more countries coming up and invoking the Philippine Arbitration Award in one way or another. The Malaysians in some ways, the French, the Germans, and the British much more clearly in a nota verbale, even the Indonesians. Vietnam, more or less since 2016, has supported the key contents of the arbitration award, which rejected the 9-dash line and confirmed more or less the maritime entitlement of smaller countries in the region, including the Philippines. So we have moved a long way from those contentious days in early 2000s, and I think as we move forward towards 2025 and beyond, I think it's time for not perhaps only Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, but Indonesia or other countries who have similar points of view to come along, and even other countries outside the ASEAN to have more unilateral engagement with us. I mean, China can lean on Cambodias of this world, and I am not really happy with the Cambodia bashing going on inside ASEAN. I think that's very unfair, as if we in archipelagic Southeast Asia are very helpful to Cambodia and Mekong River issue among others. But I think the reality is that ASEAN multilateralism is hitting a wall unless we make some significant changes in our decision-making process. As I mentioned, we are in an institutional trap. So I think the logical way forward, which I believe is complementary to, not exclusionary to the ASEAN, is to move forward with the measure of unilateralism. Philippines' decision to take China to arbitration award, 8-9 years ago, it's not supported by ASEAN either officially or even behind the scenes that much. And yet, at the end of the day, our unilateral decision is helping the ASEAN. It has given a legal ammunition to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to Malaysia, to also defend their claims. So we have a clear evidence that sometimes even unilateralism could help the ASEAN as a collective body. Now, at the same time, it worries me that China has the audacity to try to inject certain provisions into negotiations of COC on whether, countries should have a prerogative on having military exercises with the US or allow foreign companies to come. So I think that audacity in itself is quite worrying, and it shows that ASEAN has to move forward. And if multilateralism is going to be deadlocked the way it has been, let's just not try to sugarcoat it too much, then unilateralism is the way forward. And I think if you're China, you will really take notice if the Indonesias and Philippines and Vietnams of this world, together with key Quad partners in Europe, they coordinate more on this issue, put more pressure on China, push forward for boundary negotiations in ways that we can manage and helpfully resolve our maritime disputes in accordance not only to UNCLOS in general, but the specifics of the landmark arbitration award in 2016.
Oh, thank you. We have 2 or 3 minutes for one more question or comments. Any question and comments from the room? Or, yes, please identify yourself.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hoàng Tấn Dũng. I am a former scholar of ASEAN Foundation, and I represent the scientist community of Vietnam, worrying about the issue of South China Sea, or in Vietnam we call it the East Sea of Vietnam. I would like to raise 2 questions. Regarding the presentation of the speaker from the Philippines, he mentioned about the divide and conquer strategies that China is now applying to ASEAN countries. We, as an ASEAN country member, we very much worry about these strategies. And my question is that how ASEAN countries could work together to deal with these strategies. And recently, the Prime Minister of Vietnam and also leaders of ASEAN countries have agreed to sign the regional economic, regional, the comprehensive economic partnership. So I think Vietnam will not benefit much from this this partnership agreement. And in this but India and the US has refused to join. So could you elaborate more on the thought about the agreement, this agreement? Because I believe that economics plays a very important role in solving the issue of this challenge of the issue of Vietnam, the issue. Thank you.
So, Richard?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm eating the, eating the time. I'll keep this as short as possible. You know, it's lovely to talk about China. China is China. I think we know the character of China. And I don't believe, by the way, that China is some sort of an evil empire and it's all negative with China. There's a lot of benefit we can get from China, but we have to play our cards smart. I think it's also important what can other external powers or major powers do. We are going to have a new administration in the United States. I don't think it will either be Trump-like nor Obama-like, right? I think it's going to be a kind of a synthesis of the best elements of the two, right? An element of engagement, but also an element of deterrence. And I think hopefully under the Biden administration and together with key partners in Europe, the Euro 3, I'll just call them there, Australia, Japanese, and others, there's more effort to do capacity building among key countries in ASEAN, whether it's surveillance, intelligence. There should be also more coordination in terms of diplomatic stance. I mean, the Philippines is going to move towards also a new president in the coming years, and I expect the next Filipino president to also take a tougher stance on the South China Sea. Even President Duterte is changing tack. So I think that kind of coordination is also very important as we move forward. And I think in fairness to the Trump administration, despite all of the limitations of its diplomacy in the region, although they have done more freedom of navigation operations and pushed back militarily much better than the Obama administration, is that, for instance, they have openly said they're going to oppose a COC that undermines the interests of the international community in the South China Sea. They have openly said that China's militarization of those islands is unacceptable and has to be reversed. I think the Biden administration and other key powers and Quad members and external powers should also reiterate those points that the militarization of these fish should stop. Militiazation and China's militia deployments in the region should also stop. We should move towards a triple freeze of freeze on new militarization, new militarization, and new military exercises. And we should move towards a kind of accommodation in the region that is not only beneficial for both ASEAN and China, but also for other major powers, because the South China Sea is a global arena. And on the economic issue, I'm actually very disappointed because the headlines keep on saying the RCEP is China-led. I mean, I don't think these people are doing basic research. I think Wikipedia will tell you that it was not China-led. I mean, ASEAN and Japan were behind the RCEP. I think the RCEP resuscitation or finalization shows that globalization is getting some second chance to come back. And under Biden administration, I think we're going to see push more for perhaps an expanded TPP that could bring in Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and hopefully even South Korea, if not Taiwan. And I think the Biden administration will also put more focus on trade and investment initiatives. Yes, it's true, Biden will be a crisis president. A COVID crisis, economic crisis, and post-election polarization crisis. But this is also a president who's coming with a lot of, legacy momentum, right? And I think he wants to really reverse all of the mistakes that were done under the previous administration or outgoing administration. So I won't also underestimate, and knowing the advisors around President Biden, including President Biden, I know they know the nuances of the challenges on the ground, including the necessity for an economic engagement strategy here in ASEAN, because as you correctly pointed out, economics does matter.
So, thank you, and time is up. And before I join the meeting, may I ask you to join me in showing our appreciation and thanks to our panelists and participants for their very substantive and patient contribution to our session.